Hey Megamaniacs, Mr. MegaManFan coming at you with a special video about peripherals on the Analogue Super NT. When Analogue had their restock a couple of weeks ago, I unintentionally wound up in a long Twitter conversation about what was and wasn't compatible with the Super NT. And I finally just said at the end of it, guys, when my Super NT arrives, I promise all of you I will test out every single thing that I have and find out what works and what doesn't. So you're looking at a huge bin full of Super Nintendo controllers and accessories that I have collected over the years, and I'm going to put all of these different things to the test in one shot. You may want to go ahead and get a cup of coffee and a sandwich if you're going to watch this whole thing, because we're going to be here for quite a bit. First, we're going to start with the Hyperkin Scout, which I picked up specifically because one of the questions I got asked was where you could get a Super NT compatible controller. And I was like, well, get the 8BitDo one. It's linked right on the Analogue website. But if you click on their link, it takes you to Amazon, and it's sold out, and it says, we don't know when this item will be in stock again. So I'm like, okay, I can't really recommend the 8BitDo controller to people, but the Hyperkin has the exact same dongle. It fits into the Super Nintendo port. It has the same 7 pins, so I might as well buy this and try it. That way I can be thorough, and I can give people a recommendation. It's not cheap. It's $30. It is 2.4 gigahertz like the 8BitDo one, but it's 2.4 gigahertz Bluetooth, which means it's a proprietary standard, and it requires a handshake between the controller and the receiver. You have to sync on each one. You have to hit the sync button on the receiver and the sync button on your controller, and then they will pair up together and work as you see here. The 8BitDo one is much more plug and play because it's 2.4 gigahertz, but it's not Bluetooth, so it's not a proprietary standard where they have to each juggle a protocol in order to talk to each other, and a lot of people will swear by that these days. They say standard 2.4 gigahertz is better than Bluetooth, even though they both use the same band on the radio spectrum. So technically, Bluetooth is 2.4 gigahertz just like anything else, but if it's 2.4 gigahertz without Bluetooth, you may find it works a little better for you in some cases, or at least it's quicker to sync up without all the extra steps, which if you really want to get into your gaming fast, that may alone be a reason to recommend it. But I can say the Hyperkin works perfectly with my Analogue Super NT. And the 8BitDo gamepad, I can say the exact same thing. Now, even though currently the Analogue link will take you to a dead end on Amazon, you might be able to find one of these used somewhere through a third-party seller, eBay, or Amazon merchants, whatever you have to do. And I would recommend it if you can get it that way. Fortunately for me, I ordered both this one and the NES Pro last year when they first went on sale because, hey, you don't need to have an Analogue product to use these controllers. They have the same pinouts as a regular Super Nintendo, as a regular Nintendo, so you can use them with your old school stuff. You don't need the analog HDMI output to use these controllers. If you have anything that accepts Super Nintendo or Nintendo controllers and you bought these, they will work with it. So I was using this with my regular Super Nintendo, and the NES Pro I was using with my top loader. But now that I have the Analogue products, I'll plug them into those instead. And actually, I ended up with 2 NES Pro controllers because one comes boxed with the Analogue NT Mini Noir version too. So now I can play 2-player games with it. And I guess since I have both the Hyperkin Scout and the 8BitDo SNES style controller, I can do 2-player games on the Super NT as well. But these are both quality products. I think I like the 8BitDo one just a little bit better because it's so quick to sync up. You don't even have to do anything other than hit the start button and it connects to the receiver. It's that easy. Now this is a very old school solution for playing wirelessly. I picked this one up at a video game convention years and years ago, over a decade ago. It's called the Messiah, and it takes 2 AAA batteries, and it has a very long dongle. This cable has a receiver on it way at the end, so I guess you can set it somewhere farther away from the Super Nintendo to get line of sight. And you're going to need that because it's infrared. It's not Bluetooth. So that's one reason I can't really recommend it. But at the time, there wasn't any better solution. This was the first wireless commercial Super Nintendo controller. There are a few other things about it I don't really care for. The D-pad is not a traditional D-pad. It's a disc. You can get used to it if you try hard enough, but it's sort of a pain in the ass. It just doesn't feel natural when you're playing games or selecting menu options. The actual A, B, X, Y, and shoulder buttons are nice, but instead of physical buttons you can press down for start and select, it's got this touchpad that you have to indent like you're using the button on an iPhone. You have to push in, and it doesn't even click. You just kind of have to push with your thumb until you've got enough pressure for it to make contact, and that's not very suitable for my standard. I also think you would go through a lot of batteries in time if you use this on a regular basis, but I use it so infrequently that I just pop batteries in to test it and pop them right back out again. But I can confirm we are 3 for 3 so far. Now, isn't this amusing? This is an original SNES controller that I bought for $7.51 back in 2002. And I think gamers used those pricing points because whatever the sales tax was at the time, it would round up to an even dollar. So it was like $8 for this controller. And wouldn't you know it, almost 20 years later, still works fine, does the job as a Super NT controller just like it does as a Super Nintendo controller. So if you had any doubts at this point that Super NT works with all standard Super Nintendo controllers and peripherals, then you shouldn't be too worried because I'm 4 for 4 at this point with no signs of slowing down anytime soon. But we're going to get into some of the more oddball controllers that I picked up over the years in just a minute. It was nice to go back to Old Faithful though. I've beaten a lot of Mega Man X and Super Castlevania 4 and Super Metroid with this controller, so it feels good to have it in my hand again, and the buttons and the D-pad and the shoulder buttons all feel like they work just as well as they did back in the day. Here's an interesting Super Nintendo variant. This is the one that came with the Snes Junior, or what some people call the one-chip Super Nintendo. Now you can tell the difference between this $8 one I got from Gamers and the Super Nintendo Junior by two things. First of all, if you look on the back, the logos are a little bit different. You will see here, standard Nintendo logo at the top, Super Nintendo controller. Here, you got kind of a Super Famicom seal on the Super Nintendo Junior controller. So there is a little bit of a difference if you look at them from the back. The serial numbers are also different, and this surface on the top, it's smooth on the original, but on the Junior, it's engraved. You can feel it's underneath your thumb, actually etched into the plastic. My buddy Paul sold me this controller. He was trying to get rid of a Super Nintendo Junior, and I'm like, bro, I don't need another Super Nintendo. I just want that controller with the engraved plastic. And he was like, okay, make me an offer, and I did. Unfortunately, this is his own used from back in the day Super Nintendo controller, so it works. It is compatible with Super NT, but through no fault of the Analogue, it's just really hard to use because all the buttons and contacts are worn down. Maybe I can get my friend Fix-It-Phil to help me clean it up. This ASCII-ware fighter pad is quite an oddball. It maps the left and right shoulder buttons to the top, so you can use it like a 6-button controller for fighting games. They're basically trying to emulate the Sega Genesis controller with this one, but I can say, like every other 7-pin Super Nintendo controller I've tried so far, it works with the Analogue Super NT. And can you believe I got this one for $1? I don't know what Goodwill or garage sale or church rummage sale I was at when I found this, but I'll take any Super Nintendo controller for $1, no matter how much of an odd duck it might be. And I've got another one that's also from ASCII-ware as well, that there's no price sticker on. I can't honestly tell you how much I spent on it, but it doesn't claim to be a fighter pad like this one does. They were really going for that Street Fighter 2 Mortal Kombat market, which was really, really hot in the 90s. So you can imagine that knockoff Super Nintendo controllers did big business back then. This one is more like a regular Super Nintendo controller because it doesn't map the shoulder buttons to the front, just the standard A, B, X, and Y, but it's got turbo controls for each of the buttons, including the left and right triggers. So once again, if you wanted to use this for a fighting game and spam the heck out of some of your moves, you could certainly do it with this controller. And again, it's compatible with the Super NT. I really can't imagine what controller is not going to be compatible, save for one. And we're going to get to that in a minute, but I wanted to be thorough. I did say on Twitter that I would try every single Super Nintendo controller that I had, and I have quite a few. And you've been collecting video games for over 20 years, you end up with a lot of odd ducks in that time. You get lots with extra things in them. You get stuff from rummage sales. You get stuff given to you by well-meaning people who just want to get rid of it. You end up with quite a few controllers without even trying. This one I did try, though. I bought it specifically because of the Mega Man branding, and it's also a dual port controller, so you can use it on a computer or a Super Nintendo. But I still wonder to this day why they put Mega Man on a Super Nintendo controller. Why would they not put X on it? I mean, you could stretch it and say, okay, Mega Man 7 is a Super Nintendo game, but the X games are what you most identify the Super Nintendo with. If they had put X on this controller, it would have made so much more sense to me. But they're actually pretty cheap now. Initially, when they came out, they sold for like $20, but I guess they didn't sell that well because I've seen them on clearance at half-price books for like $6 or $7 brand new. So if you need a Super Nintendo controller or a USB controller for Mac or PC, it's a pretty cheap and fairly decent quality option. Sometimes when you get the bargain bin USB controllers, the D-pad doesn't move, it's not centered very well, you get a hard press on the up or down or left or right, or the buttons aren't very responsive, but this one doesn't fall into those categories, so I can recommend it for Super NT, Super Nintendo, and PC use alike. It's a very versatile controller. It is just weird that it has Mega Man on it instead of X. Next up, the classic, the Super Famicom controller. I've had this one for about 20 years as well, because I bought a Super Famicom online, and it came bundled with 2 games and 2 controllers. 2 Ranma 1/2 games, 2 Super Nintendo controllers, and I didn't care about the Super Nintendo controllers, I just wanted something to play Super Famicom imports with. Little did I know back then, I wasn't very schooled on the retro scene when I started out, that you could actually easily mod a Super Nintendo by opening it up, cutting off a couple of connector pins on either side, little plastic pieces that are just there to block you from inserting Super Famicom cartridges. If you remove those plastic pins, you've got Super Nintendo and Super Famicom slot. You can use every cartridge in a regular Super Nintendo. It's the dumbest lockout I've ever seen. Why they thought that would stop anybody from using Japanese carts in a North American console, I don't know. I still have my Super Famicom though, and I even have another that was given to me by my friend Paul. And one works and one doesn't, so I guess the moral of this story is you're going to end up with stuff no matter what. Like I said, you end up with controllers, you end up with consoles, you just end up with things. Here's another controller that looks like it's for Super Nintendo, but it's USB. And it was in with everything else, so I thought I should at least pull it out. But as you can see, there is no USB port anywhere on the Super NT. So if you get one that's USB only, forget about it. You can't plug it into anything. But you can plug in a Super Nintendo mouse. Now, there may not be a huge number of games you can use that with. SimCity and Mario Paint and Mario and Wario for Super Famicom. Those are the only ones I can think of off the top of my head, but some of you out there watching this can probably name a dozen games that the mouse works with. I'm sure Derek at Stop Skeletons from Fighting could probably name 24, because he would be the type of person Uncle Derek would try it on every single game he owns, and then he would go out and buy some more just to try it with too. Mad shout out to Derek for being such a crazy mofo to always test the limits of what controllers work with what things. But happily, the Super Nintendo mouse does work with the Super NT, just like it works on a regular Super Nintendo. And I also have to thank my friend Phil for this one, because he gave me the Super Nintendo mouse. I guess he just had so much stuff in his bins. He was like, here, you want a mouse? Take it. I'm like, no shit, really? I mean, that kind of generosity is just the way he is. He's such a super nice guy that he can't help it. So let me help him in return and say, if you need any kind of 8-bit or 16-bit console or a Sega Game Gear fixed up, he's probably a good guy to seek out. tinyurl.com/fixitphilne, short for Nebraska. That will take you to his YouTube channel. And he's also got a Facebook group. And I've also got a cat who is investigating as I test all these Super Nintendo controllers. So say hi to Tango, because he wants to say hi to all of you. Now for the one that I knew wasn't going to work no matter what I did, and that is the Super Scope, because there is no way for the signal to be recognized by an HDMI flat panel television. You need a cathode ray tube, and unless you have one of those, it's not going to reflect the signal back to the scope. But I wanted to be thorough. I said I would be thorough, so I plugged the receiver into my Analogue Super NT, and I put batteries into the Super Scope, which coincidentally I also got from Phil, and I put it through the due testing and diligence and found no success with it. I even made sure to use fresh batteries. I bought a brand new pack of Rayovac AA batteries, which to me, that's a decent quality, affordable battery. You might prefer Duracell or Energizer, but I think that Rayovac is better than dollar store batteries, and I think even Phil would agree with that, because he's chastised me in the past for using cheap dollar store batteries. So good news, Phil, I actually bought some Rayovacs this time. I didn't go with the bargain bin crappy dollar store batteries for once. And I loaded them in, closed it up, turned it on, and got nothing. So I thought, okay, I'll try it on a cathode ray tube, and also got nothing. So, Phil, I don't know if this Super Scope doesn't work or the receiver doesn't work. You might have to help me check this one out. So, I guess I'm still going to say it doesn't work with the Super NT, but since it doesn't work on my Super Nintendo either, we're just going to have to call this one unconfirmed until I can have Phil help me test it, because I don't know whether it's the scope or the receiver that doesn't work here, but I can't get this Super Scope to work even on a cathode ray tube. And I suppose if you had a digital to analog out converter for your Super NT and you ran it from a cathode ray tube instead of out to an HDMI port television, maybe the light gun would work then, but I'm not going to buy the digital to analog converter for $80 or whatever it costs just so I can play Super Scope games through a Super NT on a cathode ray tube when I already have a Super Nintendo hooked up to a cathode ray tube to begin with. Anyway, moving on. I have two different Super Game Boys here that we're going to test, and I'm using Contra the Alien Wars because this is reputed to be one of the best Super Game Boy enhanced carts that you can get for Game Boy. It has more color palettes than a lot of the other games, and apparently the only one better than this is Super Space Invaders, which I can attest to from having that it has the full Space Invaders for Super Nintendo hidden inside of it. And when you put it into a Super Game Boy and put it into a Super Nintendo, you can actually pull up the full Space Invaders for Super Nintendo. Quite a trick. Anyway, you can see here that the Super Game Boy does indeed work on the Analogue Super NT, which doesn't come as a surprise to me because I know Kevtris designed the Field Programmable Gate Array, or FPGA for short, and he's very thorough about compatibility when it comes to the things that he works on. So you would expect the Super Game Boy to work, but the one thing you have to be careful with is when you fire up the Super Game Boy or the Super Game Boy 2, make sure you go into the audio settings on your Analogue Super NT and select audio through cartridge. Because if you don't, you'll be able to play the game, but there will be no sound. You have to toggle the sound on first for it to output through the Super Game Boy to your Super NT. A standard Super Nintendo would just accept it and pass it through, but for the Super NT, you've got to tell it what to do first, which to me is a minor inconvenience since you can get to the menu very quickly with the down and select button. So even if you forgot to do it beforehand, you can go into it, click it on, save your settings, and go right back to the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy 2 came with the Super Famicom that I ordered. I didn't even ask for it, but it turned out to be a very good thing to have because this one is clock cycle perfect. So if you care about frame rates and you want it to run at the exact speed of an original Game Boy, then you want the Super Game Boy 2. It also has a link port, so you could actually link two Super Nintendos or two Super Famicoms together and play head-to-head like you could with a link cable on the original Game Boys. I've never seen anybody do that, but you could. It's very bizarre, but it's also very cool at the exact same time. I'm Mr. MegaManFan, and this has been Super Nintendo Peripherals on the Analogue Super NT. I hope I've answered a lot of questions about compatibility, and I will give you an update on the Super Scope once Phil has had time to help me test it out.